Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Daily Defender. Glad to be with everybody again. Glad you're with us. Glad we're getting another video out to you, getting some more content out. It seems like it's been longer than I think it really has since I've done a last video, so great to be online with everybody again. Welcome back to all of the current subscribers and a big warm welcome to all the new subscribers. Great to have everybody with us. We had a really nice another kind of pop in subscribers, so really appreciate everybody. We're up now over our 80% goal of what we're trying to do. So can't thank everybody enough for the support. Really appreciate it. Please continue to subscribe. Please continue to talk about it in your networks. Comment. The comments have been great. Of course, that's, as I've said before, my favorite part of the channel is interacting with all you folks. I get to continue on my learning journey, and we get to share information back and forth, and I really enjoy that. May even look at some other platforms I think I've hinted at, taking the Daily Defender, maybe where we can even act even better, interact better. We'll see about that, kind of mulling that over. But at any rate, the video that we want to get to today, I want to go back to Smith & Wesson revolvers. You remember the last video we did was on a SIG P225. Great comments, a lot of views. If you haven't seen that one, check it out. But the channel, is, you guys know, has a large affinity to the Smith & Wesson product line and the historical side of Smith & Wesson, the law enforcement connection. And you can't do that without revolvers, and you almost, I don't think, can't do that without this firearm. This is a Highway Patrolman. This is a end frame 357 Magnum Highway Patrolman that obviously we're going to get into all the interesting parts in the deep dive. But it's a beautiful firearm. There's a lot of neat things to talk about, from the marketing aspect to agencies that used it to what Smith & Wesson was trying to do and why it was so successful for them over a 30-year period. So a lot of fun stuff to talk about. Glad to be back with everybody. And without any further ado, let's get into the deep dive on this Smith & Wesson Highway Patrolman. So as I just introduced, we have a Highway Patrolman here that we want to talk about today, and it is a really, really cool firearm. It has so much to talk about and unpack as some of these firearms. I'm going to have to kind of keep track of all the points that we want to talk about. But it's just a really, really fun firearm to talk about, as I kind of alluded to in the intro. I'm not sure, minus maybe the Chief Special, I guess, that there was another firearm more specifically or overtly marketed to law enforcement than this model, strictly from its name, the Highway Patrolman. I'm not sure it gets more direct than that. And this firearm and its features are all about law enforcement, and that's what we'll talk about, and that's what makes it so much fun and so interesting to see again and talk about. So we've got a lot to unpack. Probably the best place, again, I always try to give you guys at least some level of historical reference or balance. So probably the easiest place to start with this is the 357 Magnum as a cartridge and a handgun for Smith & Wesson. Comes out in 1935. It is, at that point, the most powerful handgun in the world, which is pretty cool, until the 44 Magnum comes along. And Smith & Wesson actually calls it, because as we know, there are no model numbers until 1957, they call it the registered Magnum. And the registered Magnum is very special. It's very special then. It's very special now. And I don't remember the exact number of years that they actually did the registered Magnum. I want to say, geez, 5 or 8 or 10. It may have been less than 10 years. It may have only been 5 or 6. I don't remember. I'll try to maybe get a notation into the video. And it was basically when had a registered number. It came with special paperwork, and you could basically custom order the gun. You could change, what you wanted on the gun. But they only did that for a number of years, and then they no longer were registered as the name, and it just simply went to the 357 Magnum. And as we just stated, in 1957, the model numbers came out, and it moved to a Model 27. Now, this is a Highway Patrolman and also technically a Model 28. And it is really internally and very, very much like, component-wise, the Model 27 that we just talked about, but with some interesting and unique changes specifically for law enforcement. And that's why they bring this gun out. And the gun comes out, the Highway Patrolman, comes out in 1954, mid 50s. Let's just call it mid 50s. And I think there's a story that it was originally going to be called the Patrolman or prototyped as the Patrolman or something like that. But by the time it's launched in the mid 50s, it's launched as a highway patrolman. And then in 1957, just a few years later, of course, it moves to a model number and it becomes the Model 28. And then your engineering changes are a Dash 1. And the Dash 1, if I remember right, was only for like a year or two, right? So the Model 28 comes out in 57, the 28-1 comes out, I guess, in 1960, and it's like for a year or two. And then they moved to the Model 28-2 in the mid 60s, and that carries all the way through to let's call it the early 80s as a Model 28-3. And so the model goes basically from 1954 all the way to the early 80s, a 30 plus year span until it's finally and unfortunately discontinued. And of course, we all know why, because the semi-automatic then took over as the primary function or primary platform for law enforcement. But that's our historical little journey, through 357 Magnum, the Model 27, and how we get to a highway patrolman and a 28. Okay, so with that established, my little journey with this firearm. I've looked at these firearms, the highway patrolman specifically, probably for the last 3 or 4 years, maybe 5, lose track of time. And you don't see many of them. I've probably seen almost as many over those course of years, so 3 or 4 or 5. I always have an affinity for 4-inch. I'm not much of a 6-inch guy. I do like 3-inch, 5-inch are very hard to find. However, the highway patrolman, and we'll get into these little details, some are bigger details than others, but one of the little details was that the highway patrolman was only offered in 4 and 6-inch. There were no other barrel lengths offered. And that was, again, one of the reasons for the highway patrolman, and we can kind of get into that now, was to get a lower cost and utilitarian style firearm in the hands of law enforcement officers. And that's exactly what this whole firearm is about and what we'll talk about. And you'll see all these little features and product specs and things like that, like the barrel lengths, come into play. Again, back to my journey real quick. Had not really seen a lot of these. I think most of the ones I had seen were very early versions. I think 60s and early 70s. Can't remember if I saw one from the late 50s. I personally always had a little bit of a love-hate relationship with this one, and only because of the finish. And I almost kind of hate to say it, but it is what it is, that the finish on the highway patrolman, and we can kind of move this up, and this is a clear and safe firearm. Hopefully you guys can see that on camera, and I'm going to bring another firearm in here to play. I think that's you can kind of see this, what they call the satin blue, and this blue was specifically different than the other high gloss bluing that Smith & Wesson was using. One of the maybe the best places you can see it is here on the back strap. You can see this very matte blue finish here. I think that comes off probably the best on camera. Now, just back to that for a second, my journey with this, I had kind of been turned off by the early matte blue finishes. And I have read that there were variances over the 30 plus years on what this satin blue looked like. I think it's also been called matte blue and low gloss and some other terms. I think satin blue is the correct term, and I'll show you in a catalog in a minute why that's also true. But I had this love-hate relationship with this particular finish because I really, as I've said on this channel before, this is another clear and safe firearm. This 19-3 got a few fingerprints on it there, but the high gloss bluing that Smith & Wesson is known for, this midnight blue, to me, as I've said before, is just gorgeous. It's kind of intoxicating, especially when you get a good one. And so I've always really, really liked this. I just love this finish. So I struggled a little bit. Again, I have to admit it. I struggled a little bit with the finish on these highway patrolmans. But then I come across this one, and again, just kind of getting through all these little details that we have to unpack. This one, based on the serial number, it's an N serial number, 6 digits, and that puts it basically in the late 70s. I'm going to peg it somewhere between 78 and 1980. because it's impossible without a letter or contacting Smith, which I did not do, to really verify just by serial number when it was produced. But I think we're safe in late 1970s, right around 1980. And I do believe that some of the bluing had changed a little bit. And for me, this one works. To kind of bring this back into camera, this one has enough depth to it and a little bit of a sheen, and 4-inch, which I love. I'll get to the stocks in a minute. These are not original, but we do have the original. So this was just this one just checked all the boxes for me. The condition, it came with the original box. I'll show you that as well. This just worked for me. So it's possible that, and I would love to hear the comments from you folks. Again, basically my research seems to indicate that there were variances or hue differences in this satin blue that Smith & Wesson was making. And let's just get to that real quick, because I know you guys love the specs. I've gotten the comments. I'm listening to the comments that you guys want specifications. This is probably the best way to go. We've got a 1975 official Smith & Wesson catalog. So we've got common knowledge here, and we've got a price list. We'll get to that in a second. But here is the Highway Patrolman. I'll try to get this into camera as best I can, but of course I'll read it to you as well. From 1975, Highway Patrolman end frame. This is a large end frame 357 Magnum. Of course, it also shoots 38 Special. It's a 6-shot. 4 and 6-inch are the only barrel lengths, as we've mentioned. Weight is 41 3/4 for the 4-inch. It's 44 ounces for the 6-inch. The front sights were what they called a quick draw plain front ramp, and we'll take a look at that when we do the deep dive. The rears were adjustable for windage and elevation. The stocks were standard walnut service, or the target stocks were optional. And the finish, there it is, Smith & Wesson satin blue with a sandblast stippling on barrel rib and frame edging. And again, we'll talk through that on the deep dive, and we'll get to that in a minute. But I think you guys probably also want to know what the gun cost in 1975. This is always mind-blowing to me. I'm not sure the camera's picking it up there. Highway Patrolman with the standard stock, $138 and change, and with the target stock, it was $145 and change. And you couldn't touch one today for those. So that's always very interesting. Nice to kind of go back in time. The stocks, we just talked about the stocks. These are not original. These are the original stocks that came on the firearm. Walnut, very pretty. These are in very, very good shape, as the firearm is. You'll see that as we do the walk around. Again, part of this Highway Patrolman, it was supplied with simple, basic Magna stocks, and that's what you got. The target stocks were optional. I'll talk about these. These are not original. But again, simplicity, cost, etc. We know that a lot of people, myself included, are not huge fans of these. They don't fit people's hands well. There's a lot of grip adapters that are placed on these. But of course, I think the target stock, and of course, we talked about it before, the rubber stocks are all very, very popular, because as pretty as these are, they weren't overly useful. I said before, it's amazing that Smith & Wesson stuck with these over the decades like they did. Back to this firearm and kind of the deep dive. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll get to the stocks, I promise. Deep dive. So we've already talked about the 800-pound gorilla in the room. That is the satin blue. That is the one major thing that distinguishes this different than the 27. On this firearm, I should say, we have Smith & Wesson stamped into the barrel. Looks excellent. We still have a pinned barrel at this point. I mentioned, I hope, several times now that this is an end frame. So this is a very large frame 357 Magnum revolver. I also actually forget how big this frame is. If you're working with K frames and J frames and you pull one of these out of the safe, you're like, oh yeah, they forget how big that firearm is. Full lug on the frame. Again, clear and safe firearm, but we have recessed cylinder here, and we won't kind of get into the deep woods on that, or into the weeds on that, just so we don't continue to kind of make the video longer than it has to be. But this particular model, I believe all the Highway Patrolmans, I can check that. I believe all the Highway Patrolmans had the recessed cylinders, so that's very, very nice. Traditional thumb release there. Of course, all the parts would have been forged. And again, the gun is basically a Model 27, minus some of these things I'm pointing out that would have been different specifically to the Highway Patrolman. Back to these stocks. I like the Target stocks. I've said that before on the channel. I do not have an original set, a time period original to go with this firearm. If I can find one that isn't half the cost of the gun, I'll probably add it. These are just a mid-grade, aftermarket grip that works, or stock that works for me, and very, very nice wood, dark wood grain, and it sets it off. It looks really pretty on the gun. So that's the stocks that we have. I'll get to the sights. Let's just flip the firearm over so you guys can see that. Of course, this is, I guess, maybe the best part of the firearm, right? This side of the barrel is 357 CTG, which is cartridge. And then we have the fantastic Highway Patrolman stamped into the barrel, which, again, just is cool. And then we have traditional 4-line Smith & Wesson information here, and a very large Smith & Wesson logo, stamp there, trademark stamp. And that's all we have on this side of the firearm. Sights, we already read off what the sights were in the catalog, but we've got this front quick draw sight, as they called it, no red inlet, and then no white outline, but adjustable for wind and elevation. One of the other differences on the Highway Patrolman was the lack of additional machining and work up here on the top. If we come back to the 19 for a minute, you'll see what that looks like. You can see this additional machining and craftsmanship, if you will, into the firearm there. And of course, the high gloss blue, which we've already talked about. And what else on the Highway Patrolman? It still has the grooves on the back strap. And again, we kind of talked about where you can really kind of see on the back here how that satin finish looked, at least on this part. Thankfully, as I've already said, this one has just a little bit of sheen to it, which is what really attracted me to it. The gun is in phenomenal shape. It has a little bit of a scratch or a scuff there. It's got a little bit of a cylinder line, but other than that, the firearm is fantastic. I think I mentioned that it came with the original box, so let's go ahead and get that over here. Traditional Smith & Wesson box for that era. It is serial number matching, so we've got all that, 28-2 with a serial number. I think I mentioned it's an N 6-digit serial number, so we know basically when it was manufactured. What came in the box? We have a marketing piece here from Smith & Wesson, which is pretty common for that era. We have a warranty service center piece of information, marketing information, which is great. We actually have the original warranty card, which is great to see. I can open that up here a little bit, see what that looks like on camera. Very, very cool to see that. My understanding is that's not, you don't see the warranty cards very often, I guess is the statement I should make. We do thankfully have an original Highway Patrolman revolver Model 28 instruction and maintenance guide, which is fantastic. Love that. Of course, it always has the exploded diagram and information in there, but it's just part of the historical side and collector side to have that with the original box. I'll get to that in a second. And we have about half of the original wax paper as part of that box. So that was all great to see, and very glad to see that in there. I just took an extra minute with this one because this is the Smith & Wesson marketing information at that time for the Smith & Wesson ammunition, and it has some very interesting information in that with the logo. And I just thought I'd state that you can find this information. I have a couple of these boxes that I've located. This is the original Smith & Wesson ammunition in these boxes. This actually has almost a full box of ammunition. And it's appropriate. This is the 357 Magnum 158 grain jacketed soft point. So this is what some of that would have looked like from back in the day as well. And it just happens to match the ammunition marketing information that was in the box. So that was all great. It's fantastic. Like I said, not only could I found a 4-inch Highway Patrolman that in a bluing that in maybe condition of the gun that I really wanted with the original box and paperwork. Really couldn't ask for much more than that. The other 2 points I wanted to make were how did it shoot? I know folks always ask me that. In classic Smith & Wesson revolver of this day and age, and again, I talked about it on the channel, from the 30s forward, maybe from the 50s forward to the mid 90s, Smith & Wesson was producing excellent firearms, excellent product. This is another one of those with the forged metal parts, and it shot beautifully. It worked perfectly. 38 Special was just a joy, as you can imagine, in an end frame, a big, heavy end frame. The recoil is almost non-existent. Unfortunately, I didn't actually have 357 Magnum with me that day, so we didn't shoot any of that through this, but the gun was a treat and a joy. What else did I want to tell you about it? I think that really kind of wraps up what we wanted to talk about, this Highway Patrolman. It's just a great, great part of Smith & Wesson history. And again, I think shows and highlights just how important law enforcement was to Smith & Wesson and how closely they were listening to them and what their needs were. And so to come in with a more utilitarian product that maybe the officer didn't have to worry so much about, scuffing and changing the high gloss blue, and at a price point that was a little easier either for the individual or the department, that was their goal with this firearm. So great. Glad it's in the collection. Glad I got to bring it to you. What I'd really like to hear is from you guys in the comments, and especially from officers that carried it, used it, kind of all the hype about it, how it was delivered. Did they actually deliver them in those blue boxes? Were they more of a mass distribution? Was it kind of mass packaging or something like that? That would be interesting to know, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, how it was actually issued. What people thought about them. My understanding is they were very popular, and I guess it goes back to why we don't see a lot of them in the shops. And I think on one hand, I think I know why that is. I hope I know why that is, and I hope it's because people are holding on to them. Because they were probably a law enforcement, they had them. There's a lot of sentimental value. They were allowed to purchase or keep them, and they have, and then they're handing them down to generations. And thankfully, I hope generations are appreciating what they're getting, or maybe they get it, that it's a great link back to a passed on loved one with the firearm, and bring something back, bring some nostalgia back, bring some personal connection back to the person who had it. So on one hand, I'm glad we don't see that many in the shops, and maybe people are holding on to them for that great reason. Of course, on the other hand, from a selfish standpoint, we'd like to see more in the shops, because then we have more options and the prices wouldn't be so high. But I'm hoping that people are holding on to them because of these great sentimental values, whether they're Chief Specials or Highway Patrolmans or Model 39s or whatever. So yeah, but I would love to hear from some folks about your experiences with Highway Patrolmans, and also the blued finish. From what I've read, there were some variances in this satin blue finish over the 30 plus years. So it'd be great to have some comment on that. So I think that rounds out what we wanted to talk about today. Thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate it. And we'll see everybody again very, very soon on the Daily Defender.